I'm Amy Bach. I'm the executive director and founder of Measures for Justice. And I'm here for a short conversation with Solution Journalism Network's David Bornstein and the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform's David Mohammed. And we're going to really have an honest conversation about the state of our nation's criminal justice system. We're going to cover what's working, what's needed, and where the biggest opportunities exist. Luckily, we've got, kicking it off, David Bornstein, master of seeing what solutions work. Can you give us a general gestalt sense of what you've seen work with complex problems as part of Solutions Journalism Network?
Yeah, sure. So I think, the way the world understands the criminal justice system or most issues is the way it's mediated by journalism, because we can only see so far. And the way journalism tends to describe systems is through what's broken in those systems, what's outrageous, what are the worst actors, where is the problem causing the greatest kind of suffering. Very important information for a system to improve, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. I think what we most need to understand how to improve systems, and this is where our work comes in, is really understanding where the new ideas are emerging, what is working better, how are people improvising new solutions, what can we learn from what we call the positive deviants, the people out there. There's more than 3,000 counties in the United States. There's a lot of opportunity for people at the local level, even at the state level, to be innovating and trying new things. COVID has, of course, been a very important factor driving innovation in the system because of the need in many areas. And so I think the most important thing we could do now is really look at capturing the positive deviants. Where are the good ideas emerging around all sorts of dimensions in the criminal justice system? And then making sure that that knowledge is turned into how-tos and blueprints and then widely shared, because we probably have a tremendous amount of knowledge that exists that's not yet being applied anywhere near the scale it could be applied.
What you're saying about positive deviance really resonates with us. When we first started at Measures for Justice, we set out to measure and compare counties and their performance. And a lot of people don't realize this, but the government doesn't actually collect or publish local criminal justice data. So we were the first to really map 20 states worth of court data. And the data is being used, right, to generate policy change. But one of the things that we found was that people really needed a path to and a goal to meet when they had the data. So what we did was we created this tool, and we're calling it Commons, but the idea is to publish near real-time data that wasn't publicly available before using law enforcement data, and then bringing in communities and law enforcement together to co-create shared goals. And one of the things that we found is that the goals, when they're devised together, really puts a fire under both parties to be more accountable. So it's the transparency that really leads to the accountability, and putting it in their hands with the goal. And in one place, which actually we had our pilot, it's called YOLO County, the prosecutor's office was the first one to get it. And they had this input from the community group, and it changed this major policy about a few months after the data was released. And we often think about, well, what was the positive deviance there? What made the change? And what we think it was is that people want to get ahead of the data. So the policy change was that they saw racial disparities in cases being sent to the office by the police, and now defendants, even if they have a criminal history, can qualify for services like mental health and housing. So I think what is going right is using the data to give permission to make changes that should have been made long ago, and putting it into the hands of people from day one with responsibility to goal set. And so that's, I think, the thing that we're going to be, really driving across the country. But I want to pose this question for David, because you're working with us on a commons in Rochester, which is hard going, right? Which is for the same reasons that change is hard going. In your work with the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, what are you seeing? And what's working, and where do you see the biggest lessons learned?
Certainly. So one, good to be with you all in this important discussion. The National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, we're based in Oakland, California, but we work in cities across the country on two primary pieces, bodies of work: to improve the criminal justice system, to reform the criminal justice system, and also to reduce violence. And what we have seen across the country is at a time in last year and parts of this year, an awakening of the need to make massive reforms to our very broken criminal justice system, a system that has evolved into mass incarceration with extraordinary racial biases and disparities, but also one that is ineffective, and harmful, and excessively expensive. And so the criminal justice system does not work, it makes people worse, and it costs too much. And therefore, we need to reduce the size of the system, improve how the system works, and reinvest funds from a reduced system back into communities. And we've seen signs of success. In California, there has been a series of legislation as well as voter-approved ballot initiatives that have achieved this reduced system, improved system, and reinvestment back into communities. It hasn't gone far enough. And around the country, we have seen movement. I think the work of Commons and this transparency around data, so people can be aware of how the system operates, what is the information that they need to make good decisions about what reforms are needed. There is a concern today that with an increase in violence in cities around the country, that there is this knee-jerk reaction to recoil and go back to the horrible old days of mass incarceration, which would only make things worse. And so while there is hope in progress that has been made in the last few years, there's also deep concern about what might be on the horizon.
David Bornstein, I'm sure you've seen this dialectic, right, in other spheres. Can you give us an example of how a solution actually could maintain progress beyond, the political wins, which, we see this right now with bail reform, right? Yeah. The prosecutor in Milwaukee, Wisconsin is being blamed for the man who ran his van into the parade because the bail was a small bail, but now it turns out New York Times, they actually pointed to our data and said, look, it was just his bails aren't actually worse than the rest of the state. He's actually his bails are actually significantly higher than the rest of the state. And what can ground people? How can we get the change to sustain itself and not be like a feather in the wind going back and forth between the dialectic here that is so much of what the United States has become?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, policy by anecdote is what happens. Like one example, one case has happened to Michael Dukakis, as we all well remember, where one case that may be an outlier in the data set is the one that gets all the attention and it skews the conversation. And we've seen over and over again that when you look at large data sets, I mean, microfinance, the whole field of microfinance, there's probably more than 1 billion people in the world today that are benefiting from small loans because the data showed that poor people were creditworthy. You could see that. You see large data sets are the ones that tell you which hospitals have the highest patient safety rates and which ones have the lowest and what needs to change to do that. You can't look at an individual doctor or an individual surgeon to try to understand this. You have to look at the aggregates, the law of large numbers. But some of the research shows that people don't, it's hard for people to understand large data sets as well as anecdotes. And one of the things that really makes it more easier to appreciate is actually graphics, showing the data through visualizations rather than through tables or spreadsheets or lists of numbers and so forth. So the idea of they've done this in medicine through what they call patient decision aids, where they try to help people who are struggling with a diagnosis understand how to make a decision for themselves. And they find that often giving them visual aids to understand relative risks and benefits to different treatment modalities is very helpful for people. It's not just a question that people aren't, math or aren't as numerate. It's a function of the way, sort of what they call the availability heuristic, the way the mind works and how we focus very much on salient, highly emotional pieces of information. We tend to overweight them in terms of probabilities. So we always have to deal with, we have to find ways to deal with the rational mind, which can counter the availability heuristic. And so really understanding how to translate data into mechanisms that work with the emotional system as well is a really important piece of this puzzle.
Yeah, that is such a good point. I mean, how can we channel what's working into the emotional system? I mean, I find that, like, at least with Commons and YOLO, what we're finding is a lot of FOMO, a lot of fear of missing out around California now. Like, well, why don't we have this? They have this. Like, what role, David Mohammed, does FOMO at all play a role in your work, that, that we have to sort of publicize the wins to make other people get there and have the emotional sense that it's their victory as well?
Absolutely. People want to see an example. People don't want to miss out on success. This is why we have to give the stories behind the data. The data is extraordinarily important, particularly for policymakers. But I think for the general public, they need the stories. I need to understand how someone who is suffering from substance abuse, who is challenged with being able to find employment, that when they are incarcerated, when they steal something, versus when they receive treatment and intervention and job opportunities, how there could be a life-changing transformation in that outcome versus making someone actually have worse outcomes and increase their criminality through incarceration. And I think that story, which is just a true story, but there's also data to support that, right? That when you have people with low-level offenses and who have some underlying challenge like substance abuse or mental health, when they receive quality services and treatment instead of incarceration, that they can go on to have successful, productive lives and not engage in crime. And I think that, so we both have to have the data to show that this is what happens usually, and this what can happen, but we also need that story to talk about that individual who has been able to get the type of support that they need and no longer engage in crime. And so we understand this is not only about doing what's right, but it's also improving public safety. So yes, when you have, I remember when California passed Prop 47, it took a bunch of low-level felonies and turned them into misdemeanors and reinvested savings from that back into services. Several states started reaching out to the advocates and the legislators who were responsible for that, for this FOMO, as you mentioned, right? That they wanted to also be a part of it. And we saw several states take similar measures moving forward. So I think the example and the stories and the data can be incredibly helpful.
David, you have anything to add? David Bornstein?
I would say, the stories that you're saying, as well as, we need two kinds of data to really make the case for the reform in the criminal justice system. One is the data that shows how much more dangerous the criminal justice system makes the society, how it actually contributes to the problem it's supposed to be solving for. And there's, And then, as you were saying, the data and the stories that really show that people within the criminal justice system are who they really are, you know? And how do you tell those stories? Because they are rendered as stereotypes in the news, as flattened out individuals rather than three-dimensional people. I think one thing I would add is just, I've done a lot of research on childhood trauma in my column. And we've looked at things like, the prevalence of ACE scores in Head Start programs and in public schools and in other centers. And when you realize that you actually have a numeric way of assessing the risk profile of a 4-year-old in terms of what they've been exposed to already at that age, of things that are causing them to be very vigilant and to feel profoundly unsafe. And in some cases, having difficulty controlling their strong emotions. This is what the kindergarten teachers will tell you. When you really understand how much this grows out of so many social problems in society, it can't help but humanize the way you look at everyone. And it's not just people who commit offenses, it's people working in the justice system, it's the prison guards. They have high ACE scores too. I mean, it's all of the actors are dealing with some similar set of really difficult situations in their lives. And they bounce off each other like pinballs, and understanding the causality can be very helpful.
What I've found helpful is, first of all, like the 1-2 punch is like the data with the story. That's the most powerful thing that you can have. But the data also brings people to the table to have that conversation with their score that you could never have had without it, right? It changes the calculus in the conversation, and it really gives people a way to say things, or even, they've got a cohort behind them where they have to say, look, I can't do what you want me to do here. I'm gonna have to do this other thing that the opponent wants us to do. It gives them a way to say, look, we've got to make some change here. So in the last few minutes that we've got here, for me, the holy grail that we're going to be doing is police data and developing a national set of policing measures with buy-in from community groups and law enforcement. That, for us, we're going to put that with the prosecutor data, and that's going to be more than a 1-2 punch, because you're going to have communities that are just chomping at the bit to talk about what kind of actionable benchmark change can you make in policing. So we're super excited about that. And we want to bring commons nationwide. Those are our number ones. But with the time we have left, what's on your list for the year ahead as we think about improving our criminal justice system? And I know, David Bornstein, that you're not a criminal justice guy per se. You're a positive deviance solutions journalism guru. But if you could make one wish for us, what would it be? And then let's end with David Mohammed.
I would say the most important thing would be to identify the positive deviance within very specific subsets of reform, whether it's bail reform or sentencing reform or parole reform, what have you. Find out what are the 2 or 3 or 4 places that have made the most headway that the data suggests is working, and then reverse engineer, try to figure out what happened there, what really happened, how much of it is locally idiosyncratic and driven by personality, and how much is really applied systems thinking, changes in the way the systems are behaving, but really to try to translate those from poems to blueprints so that other people can use them.
And I love that, David. And for me, I think, Amy, what you said, it's these 3 pieces for NICJR coming together, which some people see as being conflicting, and we see being working together in terms of criminal justice reform, which is jail, prison reduction, probation, parole reduction. Second, police reform, reducing the number of uses of force, reducing the number of arrests, improving the quality of policing, and third, violence reduction. And really all 3 of those can come together, and what we call reduce, improve, and reinvest is really reduce the size of the system and focus on the few individuals who are a genuine risk to public safety. improve the system, and so that what they are receiving is actual treatment, rehabilitation, and intervention, not just pure warehousing, punishment, and making them worse. And then we spend a lot of money on incarceration. We spend a lot, most city budgets, half or more is on policing. If we could better allocate resources and investment in communities and focus law enforcement and corrections on the smaller population that has a real impact on public safety, we can really have a win-win. We could have improved public safety, improved investment in communities, and a reduced footprint of law enforcement and corrections.